She's absolutely brilliant at puzzles. She can do 1,000-piece puzzles better than anybody else can. She sees things by the connection of the pieces and the colours. So she wouldn't, like most adults, say, oh, let's start round the edge and then we'll do the bit in the middle. She starts with a symbol or a colour. She's got amazing eyesight for detail.
Welcome to Wisdom Shared, where parents are the experts and connections inspire change. My name is Carol Blue Eyes, and today on my 9th episode, I interview Simon Ratcliffe, who I met at a Seth Godin podcasting workshop. In his podcast, Turning the Tables, Simon interviews people who have overcome diversity, something Simon is familiar with himself because of his experience suffering with chronic fatigue syndrome and eventually recovering from this little understood chronic illness, which had a huge effect on how he approached his life going forward.
People talk about the gift of adversity, and I think that was because it changed my outlook on life.
I had the privilege of talking to Simon about his life as a successful businessman and as the father of Francesca, now 20 years old, who was diagnosed at age 3 with Dravet syndrome, also known as severe myoclonic epilepsy of infancy. Simon generously shares his experience as Francesca's dad, and he describes how Francesca has taught him how important it is to get to know the special needs kids who are on the bus, so to speak.
Over a period of time, I just got to know those kids, being able to engage, getting to know their names. It completely changed my whole outlook. And I realized that transition is what everybody needs to go through. That's seeing individuals, not labels.
Simon describes Francesca's special role in his recovery while he was sick. He takes us on a journey of his own self-awareness, both of his own inner workings that may have contributed to his illness and his new outlook, and also to the awareness of Francesca's unique qualities, the importance of getting to know each child for who they are as people first. I started Wisdom Shared to provide a forum for parents to share their reality, their wisdom with others as experts on the front lines. Simon's story exemplifies the importance of putting on the oxygen on oneself first before helping other children, as the airline attendants recommend before taking off on an airplane. Simon is a living example of why this is important. Simon also speaks about inclusion and diversity in education and in the workforce when it comes to people with special needs. I ran into some adversity myself when putting together this episode, as I lost the original recording and had to rely on the backup audio. You may notice that my voice is not well recorded, while Simon's recording was a saving grace, which is why I look at today's episode through rose-colored spectacles, a reference that Simon uses in this interview, which reflects seeing the positive, the wisdom, and the beauty amidst the messy reality. This story was meant to be told. Today, I have Simon Ratcliffe on my podcast. He is an entrepreneur, a podcaster himself, a photographer, a videographer, a husband, and father of 3. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Carol. Good to be here.
Welcome to Wisdom Shared.
Thank you for inviting me.
Tell us a little bit about Francesca. What was her birth like? What is she experiencing now?
Francesca was a completely normal birth. She was our 3rd, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But what happened after, I think it was Christmas, when she was 6 months old, we were sitting preparing Christmas, preparation for Christmas the next day. And she was in her cot on the kitchen floor, one of those bouncers that you get that put kids in. And we suddenly looked around and she was fitting, quite violently fitting.
Having a seizure?
And having a seizure, yeah, having a seizure. It's one of those moments, obviously you were terrified. I mean, and so terrified that we didn't even ring the ambulance, which is what you kind of would think you normally do. We just put her in the car and drove her to the hospital. Literally, fortunately, it was only about 15 minutes away. But we didn't think to do anything. Literally, just you think your child is dying, basically. So you think, I can't be sitting waiting here for an ambulance. So we just drove her to the hospital. She had the seizure for 2.5 hours. and eventually came round. Obviously, they gave her various medications to help her come round. At that point, there is something called febrile convulsions, and completely abnormal for a child to have a seizure when they're younger. So we were unsure, and the medical people were unsure about what was this. So we were discharged, but then she carried on having those seizures at regular points, and obviously then they had more tests and blah blah blah, and eventually she got diagnosed with this condition called Dravet syndrome, which was discovered by a French physician called Charlotte Dravet, and it's a relatively rare epileptic condition with associated developmental delay, significant developmental delay. And so over the ensuing years, they worked with different types of medications to try and control the seizures, not with a great deal of success in the beginning. She would sometimes fit it 2 or 3 times a day. It was very intermittent. But latterly, they got control of it, and her seizures were much less frequent, which enabled you to start to normalize life to some degree. However, it was clear that a developmental delay would mean that she would need, special school and special help.
How old was she when she was diagnosed with that?
Finally diagnosed, I think she was about 3 by that time, 3 or...
So you went through a lot of years just not understanding what was going on.
Well, yeah, sort of suspecting, but not finally knowing.
I'm just curious, was the developmental delay in this kind of syndrome due to the seizures, or would someone have that anyway?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. They find it difficult to distinguish between the two things, but they believe there is a genetic element of it, if you see what I mean. So it's part of the condition. Although, obviously, if you have a long seizure at a young age, that does affect the development of the brain, because it starves the brain of oxygen at a time when it's, evolving. So
Tell us about Francesca. What is she like as a person?
she's now 20. She still is a child in in all regards, cognitively, but she is a very engaging, very happy catalyst, really, for other people. She will change the nature of a conversation. She will change the nature of a room. She will shine a light. It's just a tremendous gift she's got. Quite unlike anyone I've ever met before, really. She has a way with people which is very open, very loving, very good-natured, which brings out the best in anyone. And it doesn't matter whether you're the man delivering the curry on a Friday evening, or whether you're a close relative, or whether you're a man or a woman that she's met in the street. She treats pretty much people the same. If you show an openness to her, she actually shows the openness first. And generally speaking, what that does is condition the response. It's a fascinating psychological study, actually. Yeah, she has a transforming effect.
And what are some of the things she likes to do?
She's absolutely brilliant at puzzles. So she can do 1,000-piece puzzles better than anybody else can. She sees things by the connection of the pieces and the colours. So she wouldn't, like most adults, say, oh, let's start round the edge and then we'll do the bit in the middle. She starts with a symbol or a colour or something, or pieces, which she's got amazing eyesight for detail. So she loves doing that. She loves all creative things. She loves painting, drawing. She loves singing. She loves drama. She loves all those kind of things. She loves sport, playing it to the level that she's able to.
How do you see labeling Francesca a special needs child? Labels, do they fit into your outlook on how you see it as a dad?
I think it's a whole difficult territory, isn't it? Special needs. I'm not too bothered by the term special needs. To me, it's much more about people understanding what that means in the sense of diversity, and understanding that anybody within that category may have multiple different needs. The one thing I really feel sure about is that the way we teach individuals with that, certainly children with that condition, is still quite limited. I see a lot of kids with these conditions have a lot of potential, but because of the resources needed to bring that out in a child, that they end up settling for good average. So the education is more geared around helping their independence, which is fine. But a lot of children like Francesca will not be able to live an independent life. So that is limited horizon for them.
So what would be an alternative in your mind?
I think an alternative would be a system which looked at the individual and structured their education around and their development around those particular needs. Now, it's easy for me to say because inevitably with that comes a cost, because it means more resources and more people and more expertise. But I think that particularly with the development of technology and greater understanding of the science of how the brain works and all those things, it feels to me like in the future there are the resources available to revolutionize the way we help special needs people develop. But it requires a lot of commitment and a lot of expertise, and it requires people with special needs to be categorized as important as any other diverse group.
And the idea of diversity, I think, is really interesting. You have the diagnosis, and then it's as if everyone has certain traits because of a diagnosis, as opposed to, well, let's pretend there was no diagnosis and you have a child.
Yeah, absolutely. That needs to happen, because I think most of the development work inevitably in this area is always done by charities, special interest groups, rather than at a governmental policy level.
What kind of schooling did she have?
She started off, which was the basic, what happens in British schooling is that in the first instance, she went to a mainstream primary school. She was what they called statemented, which meant that she was then able to have one-to-one support. But of course, it becomes very apparent very early on that they are behind their peers, and therefore you have a slightly ridiculous situation where she will be being taught on her own in the corner of a classroom while the others are doing something entirely different. And they, I bless them, they do try very hard. So the people who we've had to engage with as a result of Francesca, I would have the highest regard for. They're people who are caring, committed people, but sadly lacking the level of expertise and the backing that they need to transform sort of education and care of this diverse group.
What are some of the titles of those professionals that you speak of?
Speech and language is probably the most obvious specialism that schools will engage.
Did she need rehab specialists like occupational therapy?
Occupational therapy, that was it. She's accessing that more now, because obviously now is in theory a transition period to her operating in a more adult world and in theory doing some kind of work.
But in terms of her needs for physical needs or attention or writing or even walking and running, was that ever addressed?
Yes, to a degree. She had physical therapy, but it was on very ad hoc basis. Again, resources not there to deliver it at the level. I mean, fortunately, she doesn't really have any significant physical disabilities. She's a little bit unsteady on her feet, but equally she's got a remarkable ability, a hand-to-eye coordination. So, for someone so slight, she's able to hit a ball quite a long way and, kick a football and all those kind of things. So sort of curious combination of things. And she does actually now have someone who comes to see her weekly to give her that, to help her motor skills. But it's on an ad hoc basis. We've not really got systems in place to make all that easily accessible for people.
What is her relationship with her siblings?
Very good. Obviously they love her and care for her very much. She's still capable of having an argument with them, and they're capable of having an argument with her, which is nice because that means she's a normal part of the family. Yeah, no, I mean, and I think, you know, the unspoken side of it, of course, is that it will undoubtedly have affected their lives, because when they were younger, you know, their mother's attention was directed entirely towards Francesca for obvious reasons, because it seemed like she was on the verge of, you know, death all the time. So, as you can imagine, that was something that required 24/7 attention. So, you know, yeah, the other two obviously had to take something of a back seat, which had been difficult for them.
And have you talked about that? Has that been addressed in some kind of formal?
Yeah, we have from time to time. Yeah, but I'm not sure that whether they will truly understand the impact of that until later in life. They've been fantastic with her, and obviously, you know, that they will have experienced the trauma of seizures firsthand. Sometimes they were in the position of having to deal with that and the aftermath of that, and trips in the ambulance if that was necessary and stuff like that. So they've been through the whole experience as well.
Have you seen any hints of the idea of post-traumatic stress from this kind of situation?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have, but it doesn't mean to say it's not there.
Well, I think that's also something that I have heard about, in the sense that when parents are dealing with traumatic births, which was not your case, however, later in life there were some things that were traumatic to you. Everybody's so focused on the child, and a little bit of what gets left behind in most cultures is the impact on the parents. And even though the child is going to be fine, there was still that trauma.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and the statistics make grim reading of what happens to families with special needs children. I mean, the divorce rate's very high and lots of problems. I mean, we've managed to be fairly resilient as a family, and so thankfully that hasn't happened to us, but it's not easy, put it that way.
Do you have any advice for moms and dads out there that are struggling?
I think awareness is the most important thing, to recognize that the circumstances are playing a very large part in whatever pressures and stresses that you have. Now, you kind of think, yes, I know that, but actually to understand that, you know, your behavior will be, and your partner's behavior will be affected by that. And you have to take that into account. Manage your expectations of yourself and of your partner.
What do you mean by that?
Recognize that the situation you are in, if you have a child with special needs, puts much greater pressure on you. And therefore, if you understand that, you can perhaps understand behavior which may otherwise not be understandable.
Can you describe from your point of view, your experience, what that pressure is?
I think you've got to bear in mind that looking after a child with special needs, which generally speaking means more of your time, more of your effort, more of your energy, more resources, adds another layer on top of what already is a complex situation. If you are aware of that, you are more prepared to understand.
Are you saying that the pressure is the extra attention that you have to have, the extra resources, all that increases whatever normal natural pressures we have?
Yes, yes, exactly. And you know, it's the same. It you know, it challenges the way you are as a person, the way you think you are, the way you think other people should be. There's multiple pressures that are brought to bear.
Would you put the word stress in there?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Although I think with my new hat on, I would say that stress is basically it's a concept of the mind, isn't it? It's how you view things. There is no such thing as stress. There is only how you view a situation, how you perceive things.
You asked a question in your introduction. Do we flounder or do we fly?
Yes, I was definitely floundering at the time. I'm sure some people have seen the series Mad Men. It was a fair degree of similarity. in my career in advertising. I mean, basically, people used to work incredibly hard. It was a fast environment to work in, and it put lots of pressure on from an early age. And I actually thrived in it. I mean, I really enjoyed it. And in the end, I spent nearly 30 years in advertising. And I guess that was where sort of, I guess the genes of ultimately the illness I got, which was chronic fatigue syndrome, actually started. I remember going to work one day in London. We travel on the underground, and I was going down the escalator, and it was a winter's evening. And I thought to myself, I just can't keep going on like this. Something is going to snap. And it was just a momentary thought before I sort of hurried on. And I remember seeing the people coming up the other side of the escalators, all looking incredibly strained and grey. And it was interesting looking back on it. It was like a moment. Nothing happened for another 9 months until I eventually got hit with what I thought was a virus. And I went to the doctor. And to cut a long story short, this carried on. I started to feel worse and worse and worse. But I didn't apparently have anything wrong with me until ultimately I wasn't even able to get into work. I was struggling to make it through a day.
Is this before you were married?
No, this is after I was married and well, I had all 3 kids. This is me in my 50s. Yeah. So that, of course, like everybody's normal life was going on in the back. I had the most almighty crash. I literally could not get out of bed. A trip to the bathroom was the most I could imagine we could do in a day. And I was literally lying there for like 9 months, unable to converse with people properly, feeling like I was pretty worthless to the family, couldn't work, couldn't speak to anyone, couldn't really watch television. And it was pretty awful. And I got depression, not surprisingly, as a result of all that. In the limited amount of reading I could do during a day, which was about 5 or 10 minutes, I found this person in Australia who had the condition, had it for 7 years and recovered. And he'd done that by actually setting himself the task as an engineer of understanding what was going on. And he put together a very coherent thesis for why people got the condition. And out of that, he developed a recovery program. Over the course of the next 2 years, gradually I got better. Lots of troughs on the way because it isn't a straight line curve to recovery from this condition. But ultimately, I have recovered and I've got my life back. People talk about the gift of adversity, and I think that was because it changed my outlook on life, my thinking, my perspectives, and a whole lot of other things, which frankly probably wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been through that situation.
And it's particularly relevant right now to hear your story because, of course, every person and every virus and every sickness is different. But being that we're in the middle of COVID right now, there are many people, I'm sure, experiencing very different symptoms, and not anyone has the answer. And just to hear your story is very inspiring.
Yeah, I wouldn't pretend it's easy. I wouldn't pretend I'm anything out of the ordinary, except the one thing I would say is that I determinedly stuck to the program. And I think for a lot of people with chronic conditions, they try things, and when they don't see success, they change or they give up. They believe it's not working. And my experience is that to get through a chronic illness, you have to completely reframe what the idea of recovery is. You have to recognize it is a long process. And of course, if you're someone in a job trying to look after a family, whatever it might be, that is incredibly difficult because you put huge pressure on yourself to recover.
And what was the most helpful thing to you while you were going through that?
I think the key component of it was what you might call sort of brain training, if you like, reframing your thought patterns.
So it sounds like what you discovered in part was that how you think actually affected how you felt physically.
Completely. It's not a one night, suddenly you wake up and think differently. It takes a long time for your brain to recondition itself or retrain itself around positive thoughts.
How did it affect your family?
It was tough because I think one of the things, because of the lack of clarity about this condition, there is always that thought that somehow or other, ironically, people think, oh, it's just in your mind, it's not a real thing. Snap out of it.
It almost reminds me of how mental illness in general, as probably you have a big insight into that, which was part of what you had, but not 100% of what you had, which doesn't really matter. But the idea that there's this invisible thing going on in somebody and it's hard for the outside world to understand. I wonder what helped you the most so that people who have a family member or experiencing this can know what to ask for in terms of from friends or family.
You've got to utterly trust that other person. What they say is how they feel. It's not a made up concept in their head, because when you have people around you who don't believe you, it undermines your own ability to recover, because the self-doubt goes on. Is it that I'm a weak person? Is it that I just, I can't do it and other people can? And is it something about me? And all that self-doubt comes in. So, but it's hard, very hard.
And then on top of raising your three children and having a relationship with your wife, how old were your children at the time?
My children are all late teen, beginning early 20s. My youngest, Francesca, who is my daughter with special needs, it's interesting because of all the people in the family who treated me the most normal, it was her, because she didn't have the conceptual understanding of what was going on for me other than Daddy's in bed all the time. So that was really interesting. And I mean, obviously all the family helped with recovery, but she had a very special part of that.
Have you run into people that made you sad to do with how they see Francesca, their reactions, or any kind of judgments by other people, or has that not really happened with you?
I think she has something unique which means that doesn't tend to happen. I think we're very lucky in that regard, because I mean, yes, people might look afar and think, well, why is she behaving strangely, or she looks like she's younger than she should be, or I mean, you could make those observations from afar, but that's not really an interaction. That's whatever people are thinking. But I think that in terms of any interaction she has with anybody, I've always found people very engaged by her. I think that's probably something about her character.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that she basically requires 24/7 care? Is that right?
Pretty much, yeah. Because obviously at night you have to be careful, because if she had a seizure, and obviously because of her cognitive level, then for most of the time she needs to be taken care of or watched, at least the rest of the time.
And how do you manage that? Do you have someone helping you, or is it just?
We have been lucky enough to have a nanny that helps us. Well, they've obviously been lots of them over the years, which helps, enable us to carry on working and things like that.
And is that something that's provided by your government or your insurance, or is that private?
Private. And, we're very fortunate to be able to do that.
And in England, do they have early intervention, or they might call it something else?
Yes, I mean, they have a lot of facilities. They aren't necessarily the ones that you would choose if you had the choice, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And they're limited. We've gone our own way. I think to some degree, and this is an interesting point really, is that whilst not denying in any way her special needs, we've tried to keep our lives as normal as possible. There is such a thing as normal.
Yeah.
So to avoid labeling and creating a sort of whole edifice around special needs, it's like any diversity, it's part of life. It just happens that Francesca has a specific set of needs. She requires more help than most people will. She won't lead the normal life that we all conceive of. You go and work and you get married and you have a family and settle down and buy a house and all that kind of stuff. That won't be her life pattern, but there are many other positive things in place that make sense.
Makes total sense.
I mean, what's one interesting thing about perception, this is slightly going back a bit, but I remember when she went to secondary school, the school that paid for by the local authority provide a special bus to take children to wherever they are at school or college. And Francesca has always absolutely loved the bus. She absolutely adores getting on the bus going, and she loves going to college or college now, but school when it was, absolutely loves it. I think she loves the one-to-one attention. She just loves engaging with people. So it's all fantastic for her. But one of the things you worry about as a parent is putting her on a bus with lots of other people with special needs. Before you knew, when she was about 8, 9, 10, there was that sort of fear about, oh, will she be okay? And, and you have visions of certain types of children and worry, basically. It all feels a bit alien. And I remember we felt exactly like that about her going on the bus, sort of anxiety, really. And I think really interesting because over a short period of time, every day, that bus arriving, Francesca getting on and starting to be able to engage with the kids completely changed my whole outlook on special needs. So, for example, you'd have a child at the back of the bus who would press their lips to the window, right? And you kind of think that's a bit scary in a funny kind of way. When you don't understand, you think that's scary. Another child that would rock in their seat, and somehow or other it felt very uncomfortable. I'm not saying this is the right feeling, but this is how you felt. But over a period of time, I just got to know those kids. And it became a really good experience, just sort of being able to engage, getting to know their names. One of them used to call me Dad for some bizarre reason, because my daughter would say Dad, and so he would repeat Dad, and that was a bit of a joke and stuff like that. So it completely changed my whole outlook on. And I realised that transition is what everybody needs to go through. That's seeing individuals, not labels. So I think, well, the majority of people are probably in the camp I was in before I had that experience.
Which was what?
Which was anxiety, lack of understanding, sort of slight fear about abnormality. I think that's definitely changing, and things like the Paralympic Games and the rest of it have helped that, I think. Particularly in relation to physical difficulties, but of course there's also mental difficulties as well. There's children that shout, that can't relate to people very easily, that there are so many different aspects of special needs that people still need to be able to understand so that they can be part of society in a positive way.
I'm just curious, have you ever thought about your chronic illness in any way as a response at all to the stressors that you had being a dad of a child with special needs?
And I know for a fact that people that get the condition is that it's what they describe as, it's like a boat sinking, too much weight on top of it. Eventually, you add one more thing and the boat starts to sink. And I think that's absolutely true. So I wouldn't say it was the reason, but on top of, the usual set of stresses and strains and pressures that people have, achiever mindset, I think that's another stress. I would be the first to admit I was someone who wanted to achieve a lot, pushed myself, didn't listen to my body. I think the outcome of that control was, in the end, the chronic fatigue. And I think it took the chronic fatigue to enable me to completely reboot my mental state, my life, my priorities, my thinking. It's like a perfect storm. So all those things come together and suddenly the body says, stop.
And then the mental stresses that we're not necessarily aware of, right? Because they're going on in the unconscious.
Yeah. And there's no doubt that, obviously having a child with special needs was part of that cocktail. So I don't think it was the reason its own, but it was, that there's no doubt in my mind, it was the body saying, you have to change the way you exist. And if you don't, then we're not going to let you go back to normal. Very powerful. Certain scenarios apply a certain extra level of stress because of, go back to this word, expectation. Our gender expectations are becoming challenged by the day, but people of my generation grew up with parents where the father was the breadwinner that looked after things, that kept people safe, all those kind of, rather obvious cliches of masculinity. And so I think when things aren't quite as they should be, that puts an extra pressure on you because there's a feeling of responsibility there. And also, I think change in expectations, quite rightly, of women in the world add another dimension to that because it's changing from the roles that one's might have been brought up in with one's mother's role, and therefore I think that does produce a sort of cocktail of implications for men and women that we haven't had to deal with before. Sort of challenges a lot of precepts. So yeah, I mean, I think we're living in times when there are many more pressures than perhaps there were.
Did you see a therapist at that time?
Yes, I did. Yeah, some help in an overall process of understanding better my own psychology and the way the mind works and the way to live your life. As I said, I talked about mindfulness. I think that's quite important. You can frame things one way, which says, okay, we have a daughter with special needs. She will never be able to live an independent life. Her medical condition means she's always at risk of awful happening, and so on and so on. Or you can look at it and say, we all learn from our children. We've been given a gift of someone who has had a amazingly positive effect on us as a family, who has loads of talent, who basically changes the nature of relationships with other people, blah 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 blah. So that's all that is describing the same set of situation but in a different way. Now perhaps you'd say, oh, that's rose-tinted spectacles, but why not? Why don't we live life on rose-tinted spectacles? Why is it a good idea to be painfully realistic about everything and thinking of all the the downsides of everything and all the negatives? Doesn't change them. Doesn't make you do anything different, because these are things that are in people's heads. So there's no difference in what you actually do in the end as a result of that negative perspective. It doesn't change anything other than how you feel.
What would you like to see change for people who have challenges or disabilities like Francesca?
The big issue for me is when someone like Francesca transitions into work, or in theory, being of a working age. What happens there? And I think that's where the wheels come off, basically, as far as national governmental support is. I'm not saying there isn't anything, but it's very hard. Businesses are not generally set up for people with these kind of sets of complex needs. There are charitable organisations, there are some schemes which local authorities run, but it is not, in no sense is it a well-oiled machine for helping move people who with special needs or enable people with special needs to work. And I my vision, this is a bit like dream time, is that to create a brand that's as attractive to people as Virgin or Costa Coffee or any great brand you can think of, that employs people, a large portion of people, all right, significant proportion of people with disability. But it's based on whatever product or service that is. People buy that because it's an aspirational product, not because of sympathy or because it's a charity or because most of the businesses, in all honesty, that people are involved in are not those kind of businesses. So I can imagine, retail, like I could imagine a florist, I could imagine a hybrid coffee house, cafe, florist. I could imagine that as a concept which you could which you could use, you could have special needs people playing a significant role in that as a business. See, at the moment, there are so many businesses who've got a diversity committee, but that diversity is entirely focused on ethnic, race, or gender. It's not, doesn't even touch the sides of disability. Nowhere to be seen. Do you know there are more disabled people in the world than there are people of mixed race? You know, we have to be clear. Not every single child will be able to be employed. Some have conditions which would make it very, very difficult. But there are plenty of people who are within the special needs category who could.
Simon's podcast, Turning the Tables, can be found wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you, Simon, for joining me today and sharing your wisdom with my audience.
Thank you, Carol. I've really enjoyed doing this interview. You've asked some great questions, and it's made me think quite hard about special needs and how Francesca has influenced our lives. So I appreciate you asking those questions. And to all those people outside who have children with special needs, I hope this has been of some insight for you and help.
Thank you so much for listening to Wisdom Shared. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to check out all our other episodes. Visit carolblueice.com. If you like what you are hearing on Wisdom Shared, please spread the word and share this podcast with your friends. Leave a review and subscribe so you can receive wisdom every month.